Good morning, everybody. So how many of you would accept $1,000 a month extra for the good of your country? Raise your hand. It's a little bit of a layup, I have to admit. Well, that's what this book is about, okay? It's about a universal basic income that would be approximately $1,000 a month for everybody, including people on Social Security, which just everybody would get it. So a little bit, I enjoy economics and have a bit of an academic background in it from BU and MIT. In 2019, I partially retired and started trying to get a big picture of world economics. I was very interested in how globalization had affected the United States. And I was also interested in how the rest of the world was developing. Were they catching up with us? How was development proceeding in the rest of the world? So I actually wrote 3 books about that, but I just put them out as PDFs on oneworldeconomics.com. And then I went on to look at what we need to do in the United States. I wrote Shares in America because I was shocked by the rise of income and wealth inequality here in the United States. And also because we're now at a unique time because of AI. So, jobs are becoming scarcer. Kids are having a hard time finding jobs. So what do we do about that? We're sort of at a unique time in history. So in this talk, we're going to take a brief look at the distribution of income around the world. We'll look at income distribution within the United States and how it's been changing over the last 50 years. Why has U.S. income inequality increased, and what is the future likely to bring if we do nothing? What is a universal basic income? And can we afford a universal basic income and the benefits of a universal basic income? So this chart shows GDP per capita from 1820 to 2018, and it's corrected for inflation. So does everybody know what GDP is? Yeah, it's the gross domestic product, which is basically the total output for final sale of a country. So it's basically everything you produce. And GDP per capita is how much you produce per person. Okay. So as you can see back here, I mean, there were rich people and poor people, but basically overall, every country was poor by today's standards. And then over the years, productivity ticked up, the amount of output per person ticked up. And why did this happen? Well, we invented the cotton gin, we mechanized agriculture, we introduced better crops, the Industrial Revolution came around. All of that increased productivity enormously. Factories could produce clothing far quicker and cloth far quicker and other things far quicker. Then, of course, it continued here, and the railroads came along, which meant you could have bigger factories and bigger farms and get everything to market. And then we had computers come in here. So as you can see, there was an enormous increase in output per person in the United States, Canada, Australia, and New Zealand. That's also happened in Western Europe. And it took about 1950 before things started taking off in the rest of the world. This little red line here is China. Sorry about that. One interesting little tidbit is that about 80% of us were involved in agriculture back in the colonial days, and it's roughly 1% today. 1% of US workers work in agriculture. So you can imagine that puts a lot of people who were working in agriculture, they had to find other jobs over the years, okay? And something similar happened in manufacturing. And for the same reason as in agriculture, it was automation and larger scale farms, better crops, more machinery. So all of that reduced the opportunity for people to find work. They had to shift to other things. So here's income inequality between countries. Hello.
Somebody on Zoom was having.
Okay.
Mute them.
So the richest countries here, these are the countries in blue, where there's over 50,000 in GDP or income, sorry, per person. And that includes the United States, Canada, Australia, the oil-soaked Middle East here, and Western Europe. China is here at the 10 to 15K. They're around 15K now, as is the other BRIC countries, Brazil. And the poorest countries in the world with less than $5,000 of GDP per person are all here in southern in sub-Saharan Africa and also in Venezuela. The developing countries, as we saw in that chart, are still way behind and poorer than the rich countries. Half the people in the world live on less than $7.50 per day. And that's in US equivalent spending power. US GDP per person was over 80,000 per year in 2023. So that's GDP per man, woman, child, retiree, everybody. So you can imagine it's a huge amount of money. China's GDP per person was around 12,500. Mexico's 13,000. Many countries have a GDP of below $1,000 per person. So income inequality between countries is very high, but it's also very high within countries. What this chart shows is the percent of national income that goes to the top 10%. So in the United States, it's around 50% of our national income that goes to the top 10%. That's pretty typical here of China and Africa. Of course, it's much lower in Africa, but the income concentration is still pretty high here. It's a little bit lower in the yellow countries here. It's about 30 to 40% in the yellow countries. That includes Canada, Australia, and most of Europe. And then it's lowest, below 30% of national GDP or national income, sorry, going to the top 10% you find in the Scandinavian countries and Iceland. In the United States, incomes are also highly skewed. What this chart shows is it shows income per household. So each of these bars represents 10% of households. Same number of households in each bar, so it's 10%. So this is the lowest 10% of households, the second lowest 10% up to the top 10% here. These guys here, and this includes all benefits. So it includes Social Security, SNAP, all the benefits that people get. What'd you say?
Destinations on your right. Oh, somebody's listening.
Okay.
On the GPS.
Anyway, yeah.
Maybe they're on their way here.
Right. So what you can see here is that there's a nice step stair of, incomes, right? It just sort of all looks pretty okay, right? And then you get this ridiculous one here on the top 10%. Okay. It's completely skewed. And within this, if you look at this, again, it's really ridiculously skewed. There's some incomes that would just go many pages high here. Okay. All right, good, great. Good. So if all US net, and that's meaning after you invest, after you depreciate your machines and so on and so forth, what's left, the net US personal income is $190,000 per household. Okay, so that's what would happen if we had all households had the same income. It would be around this $200,000 line here. Wealth inequality is even higher than income inequality by quite a bit. So the top 1% own roughly 1/3 of all the wealth in the United States. The rest of the 10%, the 90 to 99%, own roughly another third. That's the biggest piece, actually. And then what you'd call the middle class, the 50 to 90%, is about a third. And that leaves virtually nothing for the bottom 50% of Americans. I was kind of surprised by this. I thought that people would have equity in their homes and, that the bottom 50% would have much more, but that's actually the numbers. It's really true that 3 men have more wealth than the bottom 50% of Americans. Income inequality is rising in the United States. So here during the Gilded Age, which is a little before this time, you know, as you know, income was very unevenly distributed. The top 10% took home roughly 50% of national income. And then we had the Great Depression and the reforms of the, you know, the New Deal. And in 1914, we voted for the amendment that created the graduated income tax, and marginal income tax rates were very, very high here. So right after the war, the percent of national income going to the top 10% fell from about 50% down to about 35%. And meanwhile, the bottom 50%, which were at around 15% of national income, with the New Deal reforms and with the GI Bill, which was very, you know, was a great economic stimulus after the war. The bottom 50% started getting more and more of national income, up to 20% here. And then around the time Reagan was elected, everything went to hell. So the top 50%, as you can, top 10%, as you can see, their income share increased enormously, back up to Gilded Age levels. And the bottom 50% take home, including Social Security, but not other benefits, went down to about 10% of national income. So why did that happen? What happened here? So wages basically flatlined. So this chart here shows you growth. It's not actual dollars or anything, it just shows you the growth. Okay, so it shows you that the growth of the economy kept right on going in a straight line. So this is output per worker, which you could think of as GDP per person. This is net national income per worker, so those lines coincide as they should. And it just kept right on growing. But wages did not keep on growing. So for these 30 years, roughly between 1947 and 1975, wages kept growing with the economy, which is what you'd think they should do, right? I would think anyway. But in 1975, that changed, and worker earnings adjusted for inflation, including benefits, so more or less flatlined, but the economy kept growing. So of course, this money had to go somewhere. We've seen where it went. So why did wages stop growing with the economy? So you might think it was trade and globalization. A lot of people do, you know. Automation, was it automation that increased productivity so we could do more with less? Was it immigrants competing for jobs? Was it tax breaks for the wealthy? So I look at these factors in my book, and they all played a bit of a factor, but a couple of them were far more important than others, as you'll see. So the first, you know, bugbear is usually trade. People think trade hollowed out manufacturing. This is the, I don't know if you guys, I guess you can see that pretty well. So this is the share of US workers in manufacturing. It reached a peak of about 37% right after the war. And then it started going down, down, and it kept going down in a line. So this is the percent of people working in manufacturing. So I have data from 1970 on for other countries. As you can see, it went down in Canada, it went down in the UK, went down in France, and even in Germany, which is a manufacturing powerhouse and has a huge trade surplus, the percent of workers in manufacturing kept going down. And I have to point out here that this decline in the United States happened long before any trade was an issue. The United States was the big manufacturing powerhouse with a huge trade surplus down here, up here. You know, right after the war, the United States was the biggest economy in the world and doing most of the manufacturing, actually. And here you can see when NAFTA came in and when China was invited into the World Trade Organization. As you can see, it made almost no difference. So the decline in manufacturing had virtually nothing to do with trade. Okay, it was all because of automation. There have been studies done, and even during what was called the China shock, when trade with China increased enormously, at most about 2 million jobs in manufacturing were displaced. People didn't lose the employment has roughly stayed the same. So people had to lost manufacturing jobs and went to other jobs. But that was about 2 million, which is about the churn in the labor market in 1 month. Every month, about 2 million people lose their jobs and have to find new jobs. So trade was not a major factor, but it was extremely important to lowering costs. And which is one of the reasons why wages have not actually sunk, because clothing and other things are much cheaper now. Now, things that are not traded, like housing and healthcare and education, should have probably mentioned that here, are all more expensive, relatively speaking, but trade brought costs down. Did immigration impact wages? Complaints that immigration are taking our jobs go back as far as the Romans. Studies show that US immigration negatively impacted the wages of other recent immigrants and native-born workers who didn't complete high school. But economists have looked at this in detail, and they say that the wage suppression is modest, but there is a wage suppression. So if you're in construction, for example, immigrants may have caused wages to not go up as much as they might have in construction, or to stay level in construction. When measured over a longer period, studies say that immigration has little effect on wages. Immigrants are consumers as well as workers. Okay, so they drive the economy as well as work in the economy, and they basically become just like everybody else. So, you get more jobs because of immigrants, and the immigrants work on those jobs. It's just like everybody else. So it doesn't really have much of an effect. So it wasn't immigration either. Although immigration may have weakened, in some cases, the ability for people to unionize, that sort of thing. But automation is the main cause of wage stagnation. Automation and machinery reduce the need for labor. As we've talked about, agriculture employed 40% of workers in 1900 and employs about 1% today. But we produce much more food than we ever did. Manufacturing employed about 30% of workers in 1966, and now that's about 8%. But we actually produce more than we ever did in terms of manufacturing. It's just automated. And AI, of course, now will continue this trend. So other jobs are now in danger of being automated. Now, people work, but this drives wages down, because you're competing with machines, right? You're being displaced from your work, and you have to take work at whatever price you find. 80% of US workers now work in what we call services, and globalization was only a minor contributor to this change, as we've seen. So here's a little bit of basic economics. This is the dreaded supply and demand curve for labor. This is a schematic, but okay, so here you have wages, and here you have quantity of labor. So when wages are high, employers will hire fewer people. So there's less employment, higher wages, right? As wages go down, employers will employ more people, right? It's a fairly gentle slope, because employers will only employ people as demand for goods picks up. So it's a fairly gentle slope. And here's the supply of labor, and that's fairly steep, because people have to work. So they work at whatever the wage rate is. Obviously, more people will want to work when it's higher, and fewer people will work when it's lower, but it's pretty steep. People have to work, so they take whatever the market offers. So what happens when you have, automation and AI competing for jobs? There's less demand for labor. What happens to wages? Now we'll take a look here. There, that's what happens, okay? So as you can see, the demand curve for labor went down at all wages. And the equilibrium, which is where the supply and demand for labor meet, that might be $20 an hour, let's say here. I mean, it's just and then it would sink down to about maybe $15 an hour. So what happens is that as automation and AI now compete for jobs, basically, it drives down wages. People still work, There's a slight decrease in the number of people working, but people still work. They just have to take lower wages. And politics played a part in this whole process of workers not sharing fully in the growth of the economy. So continuing automation reduced demand for labor in agriculture and manufacturing and many other occupations. This led to declining inflation-adjusted wages for many. Surplus labor also allowed for union busting. In other words, if you can easily get people to replace people in a union, then you can bust the union. That's what happened. More money going to the top led to a huge increase in lobbying and political spending by business and right-wing think tanks and super PACs. Money in politics influenced politicians' policy and public opinion. The result has been legislation and tax policy that favors big money, huge tax breaks, and other policies that favor the wealthy. And we've seen this fairly dramatically last year with a big, beautiful bill. So what happened there is, it's an interesting story. There's something called the Powell Memorandum that was written in 1971, which was a blueprint by which corporate interests could use money to influence policy. Lewis Powell was a corporate lawyer for the cigarette industry. He was a bright lawyer. He went to Harvard, and he worked for the tobacco industry, and he was complaining that cigarettes actually had health benefits. So people tend to form their opinions based on where their money's coming from. His neighbor in Virginia, Eugene Sydnor, was education director of the U.S. Chamber of Commerce. The U.S. Commerce is a pretty right-wing organization. It vigorously opposed Social Security and other New Deal programs, calling them socialist and communist. And around that time, in the early 70s, Nixon and Congress had created the EPA and the Consumer Product Safety Commission. So Sydnor for the U.S. Chamber of Commerce asked Powell to come up with a plan by which corporations, including wealthy private ones, could fight public interest legislation. They wanted to, they felt that the industry was being unfairly set upon, I guess. So he suggested increased lobbying, increased political spending. He suggested that they form think tanks to push their viewpoints, that government restriction on business was socialism. And they also suggested that they get favorably judges appointed. Okay, so we've seen a lot of that since that time. And as a result, lobbying by corporations expanded enormously. Between 1978 and 2025, business spent $71 billion on lobbying, and labor spent $1.2 billion. Okay. Ultra-right think tanks like the Heritage Foundation in 1973 were set up to issue propaganda disguised as academic research. And in my book, I show you some examples of it. These groups founded media groups and funded AstroTurf organizations. There was one such organization, People for This or People for That, which had actually no citizens involved at all. It was all oil companies, that sort of thing, which repeated the same message. And the principal message that they kept hammering was that government was bad and business was good. You probably have heard this a lot. Between 1970 and 1980, public confidence in government declined by 20 percentage points. And that ushered in Reagan, of course, who famously said that government was not the solution, but the problem. And there he is. So the Heritage Foundation issued their first mandate for leadership when Reagan was elected. And the most recent mandate for leadership, the Heritage Foundation issues one every 4 years around the time of the presidential election, was Project 2025, which is the blueprint that is currently being followed by this current administration, which is actually run more by Russell Voigt, who was the guy who organized Project 2025 for the Heritage Foundation, is now the head of the Office of Management and Budget. So he's basically running things. Trump is basically a decoration on top of all that. Anyway, Reagan gave copies of his entire cabinet of Project Mandate for Leadership, and enacted most of its point, including huge tax cuts in favor of the wealthy. Poverty, especially deep poverty, increased under his presidency. The minimum wage now is lower than it was in 1983, and he lowered the maximum marginal tax rates from over 70% to under 30%, and applied that also to middle class incomes. I mean, he did a lot of good things, but he was also enacted 66% of the Mandate for Leadership points that the Heritage Foundation, and the oil companies are big donors to the Heritage Foundation, by the way. You may remember he tore the solar cells off the roof of the White House that Carter had put up there. So there's a feedback loop between money and politics, right? So corporations and rich individuals do political spending and lobbying, and that results in favorable legislation, which increases their wealth, and it goes around a circle like this. And that has, it's really, money has really soaked our politics now, unfortunately. Only 18% of the money in congressional races now comes from within the district. The better financed candidate wins over 90% of the time. So you can see how important money is, and it's coming not necessarily from the people who are electing you, but from outside interests, and it works. In 2024, big money donors spending over $5 million each provided more than 75% of the super PAC funding that went into the presidential election. So here's a quick summary. Machinery and automation has steadily reduced the need for labor. AI is predicted to do the same. That has caused most wages to lag way behind the growth of the economy. The benefits of growth have gone to the owners of capital, such as stocks, and those with in-demand skills. So if you have some rare skills, or if you're a doctor, that sort of thing, you still make a good income. As a result, income and wealth inequality are back up to Gilded Age levels. Money in politics has amplified this trend. Well, what does the future hold? More of the same if nothing changes. Automation and AI will continue to displace workers and suppress wages. There may be jobs, but they won't pay very well for most. There will be more gig and contingent workers who don't get benefits and have insecure incomes and hours, and income and wealth inequality will continue to increase. So what can we do? Well, one of the mantras that we heard a while back was bring back good paying manufacturing jobs. But actually, that will not significantly increase demand for general labor. We already have a robust manufacturing sector. It's just automated. If you cut all trade completely and brought back all manufacturing, it would result in about 3.5 million new jobs out of a total of 150 million, okay? Those jobs would not pay particularly well. Right now, manufacturing jobs don't pay all that well in the United States. And much of what we buy would cost a lot more. And it would cost the average family thousands of dollars extra because of the costs of everything that we trade going up. So what else can we do? Well, we could create, government could create jobs directly. But creating jobs that directly is inefficient. I mean, government does need to invest in infrastructure and other things like that, and that's good. We did that during the Great Depression, and that's fine. We should do that. But it's not a way to guarantee that wages will keep up the growth of the economy. European countries have a robust social safety net, higher taxes on the wealthy. I talked to a French woman who has some poor relatives in France, and she said, you know, they get along because of the safety net. So they're not in deep poverty the way they would be, homeless the way they would be in the United States. That's one possibility. And but means-tested welfare is unpopular and demeaning. Welfare programs have had no effect on the poverty rate. The minimum wage is now lower than 1983, and means-tested programs discourage work. So right now we have means-tested welfare, so that if you're poor and you get some benefits, But if you then earn more money, you lose your benefits or they decline, which is a disincentive to work, clearly. I mean, you know. And we could try direct unconditional income transfer. This is called universal basic income. So a bit of history. That automation was putting downward pressure on wages was noticed way back in the 1960s. There was actually a conservative economist named Milton Friedman, who's sort of the dean of the conservative economic school, who proposed a minimum basic income back then, right? As did Martin Luther King. Johnson declared a war on poverty, which included training and other programs that didn't reduce poverty except for the elderly mostly. He introduced a lot of programs, and some of them were very important, but they did not actually reduce poverty terribly much. Except, of course, you know, Medicare was a very big help for the elderly, and Medicaid, which became one of the biggest social welfare programs that we have. Many economists back then and business leaders across the ideological spectrum, it was pretty popular by economists across the spectrum, called for the government to supplement low wages with unconditional cash payments as an alternative to traditional welfare. President Johnson did not view giving direct cash to people as politically viable, so he set up a commission to look at it. And that commission in 1969 was called the Heinemann Commission, and it included the chairman of the board of IBM, the president of Northeast West Industry, the president of the Equitable Life Assurance Company, the chairman of Westinghouse Electric Corporation, and the chairman of the Republic National Bank of Dallas, as well as union officials, economists, and politicians. And I'm quoting now from a book called The Undeserving Poor. The commission's main recommendation was, quote, the development of a universal income supplement program to be administered by the government, making payments to all members of the population with income needs. Most people were poor because, quote, they lack money and most of them cannot increase their incomes. Only the government had the resources to provide, quote, some minimum to all need. The commission stressed that poverty did not result from personal failings and offered a blistering criticism of existing welfare programs which failed to provide adequate support or incentives and demeaned recipients. The obsolete assumption, which considered employment and receipt of welfare mutually exclusive, had become untenable in a world where many employable persons now have potential earnings below assistance payment standards. So this was a group, heavily business-dominated group, that was advocating basically for universal basic income back then. Nixon actually tried to pass a cash income supplement program, which would have been a universal basic income, as a negative income tax. So a negative income tax means that people at the top pay more, people at the bottom get a negative income tax, so they actually get income, and that sort of flattens your curve. It actually passed the House, but it failed in the Senate because of a combination of conservatives who were against it and liberals who thought it wasn't generous enough. And I think that was a failed opportunity, but it happened. Instead, in 1975, under Ford, a limited earned income tax credit was passed. But the earned income tax credit, while it's important and it does increase the earnings of some working families just above the poverty line, is pretty inadequate. It's a fairly stingy thing, and it's got all kinds of caveats on it, so it's not given to everybody. Later, of course, as we've seen, Reagan cut welfare enrollment and benefits, and Clinton ended welfare as we know it, replacing aid to family with dependent children with TANF, which was a temporary program. So the case for a universal basic income. We're faced with a structural problem, as we've seen. Automation and AI have and will continue to erode demand for labor, suppress wages, and increase income and wealth inequality. Our capitalist market economy does a fantastic job, and I'm all for it, don't get me wrong on this, of increasing productivity and creating economic growth. The problem we have is the distribution of the resultant income. So almost every country on earth now has adopted some form of managed capitalism because it really is a very good economic system, but it doesn't have any guarantees about how that income is distributed. It could all go to a very small minority of people, or it could be spread more widely. We can square this circle with a direct income transfer, which allows us all to share in that economic growth. Universal basic income is a program that does exactly that. So what is universal basic income? Universal basic income in a typical formulation is a payment made to every adult citizen, say $1,000 per month. Everyone gets the payment regardless of income. You're a billionaire, a millionaire, or poor. Everybody gets their $1,000 a month. In most formulations, a universal basic income would not be counted as income for tax or means-tested welfare purposes. The idea is that it shouldn't change anything. It should just boost everybody up by $1,000 a month. UBI would be in addition to Social Security and other benefits. Later on, we can replace some of these other means, in-kind welfare benefits with just cash because people prefer the cash. It's more flexible. But in order to raise everybody up to start with, it would just be an addition to everything else. UBI helps reduce income inequality and support lower wage workers. So here's a little picture of how this does not affect our capitalist market economy, okay? Companies, create our wealth. They create products and meet demand, right? And they reinvest part of their profits. They employ employees, so they pay wages, and they also distribute profits to owners and shareholders, okay? All of that is income. That goes into our government tax and transfer system, the IRS, basically, and it comes out. So some of it goes to meeting government needs, some of it goes to transfers. Social Security is actually a transfer. I know everybody thinks they paid into it, but it's actually paid by the current generation. It's actually a transfer of income. And so you can determine how much goes in which direction here, okay? So right now, almost all of this flows through, the profits that flow through almost always to the owners. And these guys tend to buy super yachts. They buy more stock, become wealthier, and they buy political influence, as we've seen. They also buy consumer goods, all right? But they tend to put more of their money into savings and buying stock and that sort of thing. And so there's less demand from that. On the other hand, if you send money this way to everyone else, people buy housing, they buy consumer goods, and they do some modest wealth building. And that drives more demand because there's more demand for consumer goods because people here are not buying shares and that sort of thing. They tend to buy stuff. So it actually increases demand. It actually increases your economy, grows your economy. But it has no effect on companies of deciding how they're going to meet demand. None at all. It doesn't touch our capitalist system at all. It just distributes income. And notice that the amount of income is pretty much the same, just a matter of which way it's going. So of course we can afford it. It's just distributing income. But let's talk a little bit more about, can we afford it? Okay. So can we afford UBI? This little black rectangle here is $19,000. So this is that chart we saw earlier. These are families, and each family has on average 1.6 adults. So you take the $1,000 a month, which is $12,000 a year, times 1.6, and you get $19,000 approximately. So each family would be getting $19,000 additionally, okay? So for these families that are living on $26,000, that would boost their income up to $45,000. Everybody here would gain, for some of the upper middle class, it would be a wash. Your taxes would go up just about as much as your about $19,000. And this, I have to explain that this is just based on a progressive income tax increase that I just came up with. Yeah, I have a table in my book which shows how I came up with this tax, but it's, just be one way to do it. There are many other ways of financing it, but this is results of a progressive income tax increase, okay? So you can see even people in the top 10% get their $19,000 extra, but their taxes go up. this is actually not even revenue neutral. The progressive tax increase that I created also generates 4.5 trillion in extra revenue over 10 years. So it helps address the deficit that we have, right? So you can see how much room there is that we can afford UBI, and we can also afford to start paying our way instead of boosting up the deficit. Benefits of UBI. One of the biggest benefits of UBI, first of all, it goes to everybody. Okay, so you don't have this business about whether people deserve it or don't deserve it. Everybody gets it, right? It's like Social Security. The other thing is it doesn't discourage work. Everybody gets it. If you earn more, you still get it. So you're not losing anything by earning more. So it does not discourage work. Unlike traditional means-tested welfare, there's no reduction in your share. And I call these universal basic income shares in America. It's sort of my branding of it. When you earn more. Real-world tests of UBI show that people stay employed, but there's a small decrease in hours for some. Life satisfaction is greatly increased, as is the ability to deal with sudden expenses. Shares, UBI, would help reduce income and wealth inequality and help deal with the effects of technology. So if technology reduces the demand for labor, well, you just do more transfer. Shares give us all a stake in the success and growth of our country. And by the way, when you do this transfer, you empower labor. Okay, so people, are getting their basic income. They don't have to accept really crummy jobs. They can form more unions. It generally empowers labor. Tests of UBI. There have been over 100 tests of UBI done in the United States recently and in many other countries. Sam Altman from ChatGPT financed a recent 3-year UBI study in Illinois and Texas. Results show that people stay employed with small reductions in hours. Happiness and other measures of quality of life go up substantially. And I want to read you a case study on that. Now, this is from Andy Yang's book. Andrew Yang ran on universal basic income in 2016. So in February 1974, so this talks about not just individuals, but what it does to a community having a universal basic income. In February 1974, Canada spent the equivalent of 56 million to get everyone in the town of Dauphin, a 13,000 person town northwest of Winnipeg, over the poverty line. 1,000 families got a check each month for different amounts with no restrictions. They called it MINCOME, short for minimum income. It lasted for 4 years before a conservative government won control of the government and discontinued payments. Many years later, in 2005, Evelyn Forget, an economist at the University of Manitoba, tracked down and analyzed the results. Politically, quote unquote, there was a concern that if you begin a guaranteed annual income, people would stop working and start having large families, recalls Forget. Instead, she found minimal effects on work. The only groups who worked substantially less were new mothers and teenagers, with the latter spending more time in school. Birth rates for women under 25 dropped. High school graduation rates went up. Perhaps most dramatically, Forget found that hospital visits went down 8.5%, with reductions in workplace injuries and emergency room visits. Domestic violence went down, as did mental illness-related appointments and treatments. Basically, life got better in a town without poverty. Other studies have shown that crime rate also goes down, by the way. Now, I want to make clear that this is not a class warfare kind of thing. So, Warren Buffett has said that there's class war in the United States and it's the rich against everybody else and they're winning. But many rich people are for the universal basic income. They want to live in a country which is more even, and less politically divided and so on and so forth. Because of AI, some major tech barons today support UBI. That includes Sam Altman, Elon Musk, and Mark Zuckerberg. They all support universal basic income. Over 100 mayors have joined Mayors for a Guaranteed Minimum Income, including, I heard recently, there was something here in Salem. Andrew Yang ran on a platform of UBI. Martin Luther King Jr. advocated for a guaranteed income to completely end poverty back in the 60s. And polls say that 53% of people support UBI, but that number is much higher for the young, including even Republican young. So here are a couple of quotes. Here's from Elon Musk on Twitter, or X, should I say. Universal high income via checks issued by the federal government is the best way to deal with unemployment caused by AI. AI robots will produce goods and services far in excess of the increase in the money supply, so there will not be inflation. And The Economist recently had a issue devoted to AI, and what they said is economists' predictions that work will stay plentiful is less reassuring than it looks, especially over a long horizon. Though the market will find uses for human labor, even as models, AI models, and robots become more capable, the quality of these jobs and the wages they pay are not guaranteed. So thank you for being a good audience. I'm going to treat you now to a summary, which is a nice little.
We like to think that people get what they deserve. If you work hard and make the right decisions, you should have a good life. So if it doesn't work out, we feel like it's our fault. But 43 million Americans, including 15 million children, live in poverty. I don't think it's all their fault. The job market is like a game of musical chairs, and since we depend on employment to stay out of poverty, it's like playing musical chairs over hot coals. Traditional 40-hour week, full-time jobs are becoming scarce. Meanwhile, technology is removing chairs from the game. Cars can already drive themselves. But it's not just taxi and truck drivers who should be worried. It's fast food workers, retail associates, farmers, lawyers, writers, accountants, doctors, even animators like me. All sorts of jobs can now be done in part or entirely by machines. No matter how educated we get, at some point we can't compete with their speed or cost. It should be great if we have more time, but the way our system's set up, we're in for a lot of pain. So a lot of people like me think we should have a universal basic income. It would be something like $1,000 a month, and let us live with dignity, regardless of work status. It would reduce stress and insecurity, and give us the time to focus on work that has more purpose and meaning. It'd be like a secure floor over the hot coals. Might feel wrong giving out money with no strings attached. Some think people might stop working altogether. They could spend it all on drugs or alcohol, or just play video games all day. But let's look at the evidence. Experiments and programs providing direct cash transfers have been conducted all over the world. They show that as people's economic security improves, they continue to work. More start their own businesses. Crime rates drop, health outcomes improve, more people finish school, and people are able to stay housed. Now before you call me a dirty communist in the comments section, let's go back to 1970, when 80% of Americans were for a basic income. Advocates included Martin Luther King Jr., Milton Friedman, John Kenneth Galbraith, church groups, labor unions, 1,200 economists, and President Nixon himself. These economists sent him a letter saying the country will not have met its responsibility until everyone in the nation is assured an income no less than the officially recognized definition of poverty. The cost would be substantial, but well within the country's economic and fiscal capacity. Nixon's Family Assistance Plan passed the House, but was blocked in the Senate by Republicans who said it cost too much, and Democrats who said the amount wasn't high enough. Eventually, a study came out saying basic income increased divorce. Turned out the numbers were wrong and divorce rates don't really change, but it was too late. There was a moral panic about women having too much freedom, and we haven't heard much about it since. But there is an example of basic income already happening in America. The Alaska Permanent Fund was created in 1976 from revenue generated from state land. The fund recognizes each Alaskan as a co-owner of these natural resources, and it pays all residents a dividend between $1,000 and $2,000 a year. It's widely popular, and Alaska is among the most equal of U.S. states, with the lowest rates of poverty and the highest well-being index scores. Economists from across the political spectrum agree that basic income is affordable. One way to do it is to have a negative income tax, where income is supplemented to a certain level, and benefits gradually taper off as you earn more. This is the model that almost happened in the 70s, and is being tested in Ontario right now. Another way to do it would be to have a universal basic income, where everyone gets something like $1,000 a month. This is the model I prefer, because it avoids the means testing of what the income cutoff should be, and it can cost the same as a negative income tax. Either way, bringing everyone in America above the poverty line amounts to a $900 billion transfer from the richest 20% to the rest of us. When people are desperate, crime rates go up, education rates drop, and healthcare costs rise. It's not a magic bullet that's going to solve everything, but by investing in a basic income, we save on these massive costs before they start, and won't have to worry so much when our jobs can be done by machines. Please add your voice to the growing movement for a basic income, and start conversations with your family, friends, colleagues, and elected representatives. It's time for a universal basic income.
Now, one of the answers, it seems to me, is a guaranteed annual income, a guaranteed minimum income for all people and for all families of our country. It seems to me
All right, so how do we get there? Well, you have to get involved, right? That's the only way it's going to work. It has to come from the bottom up. We've seen what's happened in politics. It's money soaked. It has to be in response to a grassroots demand, okay? Shares UBI can be easily implemented in the US. No constitutional amendment is required, unlike a lot of other things that have been suggested. It could actually be done through a reconciliation process because it's a tax increase and the distribution of money. So that can be done just as much as the big beautiful bill can be done by a reconciliation process. So it's nothing politically complicated. You just need to re-elect the right people and we could get there. So anyway, sign up as a supporter. Sign up to my shared Substack newsletter. I try to get one a week. And support candidates that support UBI Plus. I call it UBI Plus because we also need things like universal healthcare. So I have some sign-up sheets here. I have a few copies of my book. And you can go to sharesinamerica.com. I have some cards there to learn more or sign up. You'll find lots of answers to questions. I try to write something about anything that comes up as a question. All right, so that's questions and discussion.
Okay. I have a question.
Sure.
Is the Alaska program still going on? I
Yes.
haven't even heard about
Oh,
that.
yeah.
Yeah.
Is that the only state that's doing it in our country?
I believe so, yeah.
Wow, that's great.
And they love it.
I
Oh,
bet
yeah.
They
they
are
love it.
conservative people, basically. They